Hey everybody, Beau Johnston here with livingoverland.com. Today we're going to install our Dobinsons dual swing out bumper, so stay tuned. Now before we get started installing our Dobinsons dual swing out bumper on our GX460, there's a couple of things we need to take care of first. First thing we need to do is disconnect the bracket holding the trailer plug adapter from the receiver itself. There are two bolts on the side, and I'll show you how to take care of that later. The next thing we need to do is remove the receiver itself. Now this is the upgraded heavier duty receiver from Lexus. There are 4 bolts on each side that we'll need to disconnect, and then that will drop this out of the way. With the plug adapter hanging freely and the receiver removed, the next thing we'll do is we'll come in and we have to remove each one of the parking sensors in the back of the bumper. Those parking sensors will be replaced into the Dobinsons bumper. There's provisions for those backup sensors in that bumper. And then with that, with those out of the way, the next thing we'll do is we'll come in and we're going to measure for the cut. Now the Dobinsons bumper actually replaces roughly this much of the factory bumper. So roughly from where my hand is down will be removed. The bumper will go in and then we'll be able to reconnect all of our parking sensors. Now the first thing we'll do is remove the trailer plug adapter. Now you'll see there are 2 bolts on the side here. So we're using a 12mm socket to remove those bolts. With the trailer plug bracket disconnected, the next step is to remove the 4 bolts holding the receiver onto the driver's side frame rail. The back 2 bolts, which are where the tie down point is, are 17mm, and the rear or the forward 2 bolts are, you'll need a 12mm socket. Using the air gun, we will go ahead and remove those bolts. Now one thing to note is that as we remove the bolts from either side that go into the frame rails, there are still 4 bolts right at the receiver itself. I'll move the camera here in a second and I'll show you those. But first I'm going to move over to the other side, disconnect the bolts on the passenger side, knowing that there are still 4 bolts holding this assembly in place. Then as we go to remove those other bolts, we'll actually be able to drop the receiver down. Now you'll notice on the passenger side, the exhaust is actually in the way of being able to get the impact gun up and getting those bolts removed. The nice thing is right above the exhaust tip itself, the plastic bumper is notched. And it's notched just enough that we can move in, hopefully. Nope. So we are not actually able to get that breaker bar that I had hoped to use in place. We only have about 3/4 of an inch clearance below the bottom of that socket and the top of the exhaust. So let me go grab the 17mm open-ended wrench and see if we can slide that in there and kind of cheat those bolts off. So we can kind of fish that open-ended wrench in, grab our larger one as a cheater, and we'll use this to break that a little bit. Hopefully that's enough that I can get my ratcheting wrench in there and on. Again with the cheater to be able to pull those 17mm bolts out. There we go. Finish pulling that bolt out, and then we'll go after the second one doing the same thing. Yeah, and in one of those oh yeah type of moments, I was struggling trying to get the bolt, you know, from under or from over the top of the exhaust, and I'm crawling around underneath, and I realize that the panel that usually sits right here can be removed with 5 screws. So I pulled that panel down, and guess what? Now I've got access to that bolt I was struggling with earlier. Look at how much more space I have right there. So there's that bolt. Now we'll move back. We've got the two 12mm bolts over the back of the exhaust right there. I'll go grab those, and we'll be able to shift back over to right next to the receiver itself and start unbolting those bolts. All right, let's go after those 12mm bolts. Do the same principle we did before. Reach in and cheat those, get them loose. That should be enough. And then we'll reach in the ratchet wrench. There we go. Perfect. And that comes right out. Like so. And one more to go. Now you'll notice we brought in our jack. Now I want to support the receiver as I pull out these last 4 bolts. And in fact, I won't pull out 2 of those bolts completely. Now using my 17mm socket with an extension, I've got my breaker bar, and I can come in and I can pull those bolts out. Now there are 2 in the very back and 2 towards the front of this piece of the receiver. And I'm trying to be as cognizant as I can and not actually be underneath the vehicle at this point, just in case something slips and the receiver were to fall. Ooh. It is in the 20s here in Casper, and those bolts are a little cold. All right, so I've left the one in the back. I've got one here. In fact, that one is already loose. Maybe. This wasn't seated on there very well. There we go. Now we should be able to. Yep. Pull those out. And all we have left is this one. That out a little bit. And we'll go ahead, pull that out completely. There we go. Now all 4 bolts have been removed. Our trailer plug harness has been disconnected. And so I'll slowly release and drop that to the floor. Now the next thing we need to do is remove the parking sensors from the plastic bumper. Now to do this, we'll remove the black plastic clip that holds the harness in place. And with that out of the way, the easiest way to do this is to push up and down on the 2 tabs holding the sensor in place. And with your other hand, push that sensor out. May get caught a little bit, but that sensor will pull out. We'll pull those down into the side, and then that way now we have a clean area to cut. Now the outside 2 sensors have the clip, and the inner ones just have these 2 tabs in place. Now there's 2 screws that you'll have to remove holding the middle of the bumper to the frame. You go ahead and remove those with a 12mm socket, and you'll be able to flex the plastic bumper out of the way enough to get your hand up in place and remove those 2 clips. So with the parking sensors removed from the back bumper, the next step is to prepare everything for the cut. So to do this, I'm using some painter's tape to help protect the paint. And I'm going to then start laying out a series of measurements along the back of the bumper. The first measurement is from the corner here of the bumper where it meets the metal fender. So that measurement is 210 millimeters. So I'll come in and hold my ruler, and we're splitting the gap here. So we're running straight down in 210 millimeters, and we'll make our mark. The next measurement is off of our taillight assembly. So I'm going to come halfway between the corner here and our taillight assembly down in the bumper. And this measurement is 440. Hold that in place and mark 440. Now the plan here is I'm going to take our front mark, now this 440 mark, and then marry these with a series of marks that I'm going to place on the back bumper itself, which is about 20 millimeters from the lip down. We'll take all these together using a nice flexible ruler, and we'll be able to run a line all the way across to the other side. That'll be our marking that I'll follow to cut. With both sides marked the same way, the next step is to come back to the back. Now our measurement is from this lip here, this surface down, and we want to measure 20 millimeters. So I'll grab a ruler, hold that in place, and come down more, 20. And we'll go through, and what I'm thinking here is that there's the little tray that comes down in 3 spots on that back bumper, the step face on that. So in those 3 spots, I'm going to come down and measure 20 millimeters. And then I'll go through and line everything up. And this really is where a flexible ruler will come in handy. Line all those up, make sure your thing looks good. Take some time here, don't rush this. You know, there will be a little trim piece that will go on this face, but the more time you take here, measure once, cut twice. There. Now we can take this, line it up. There's a little bit of a corner which this ruler will not be able to bend around, but I've taken that mark to that, and I can bend it around now to the side. That all looks pretty good. And I can come in and scribe that line. We'll finish this up and we'll get the angle grinder out to make the cut. So after marking everything out, the next step is to go ahead and make that cut. So we'll put on some safety glasses and earplugs and start cutting. Now, one of the things I want to note is as I'm going through here, I've left 2 spots, just a little tab, so that the whole bumper just doesn't fall down. I'll come back later with some help and cut those off. The other thing that I want to note is, yes, I am able to actually make all of these cuts with my Dremel. This isn't anything fancy. It's an old Craftsman brand Dremel tool with a standard cutoff wheel on it. It is a little slow going. You don't want to rush it, but as long as you're not putting too much feed on it, it should go fairly quickly. The other thing that I just want to note here in doing this, because it is moving around all the back of the bumper, I've got one of these My Mechanic stools. It's got wheels on it. I can store tools in it. It's been a huge help, A, being able to lay everything out, and B, as I'm going through cutting, I can shift fairly easily over to the next section. So this is a huge help in trying to do something like this. We'll go ahead and finish making those cuts. I'll grab some help and we'll remove that back bumper. Now we can begin installing the Dobinsons components. Grab your driver's side bumper bracket, and using the supplied 12mm fine thread bolts with the square washers, insert those bolts into the back two spots the receiver was originally connected to. Now you'll notice in the kit there are two different styles of 12mm bolts. You want to make sure you use the fine threads for this application. There has been some confusion with folks in the past on this installation where they've tried using the coarse thread in these spots. And then finally, you'll have your little 8mm bolt that goes in the rearward position. Get this all good and finger tight. And we'll come back later once the bumper is actually installed. We'll make sure everything is aligned side to side, and then we will tighten all of this down. Now let's move over to the passenger side and show you an issue that we ran into while doing this installation on that side. Now you'll notice on the passenger side that the bumper bracket will actually interfere with the resonator on the GX460 exhaust. The tab that actually holds the resonator and the rest of the exhaust assembly in place needs to be trimmed about 3/4 of an inch in order to provide enough clearance for the bumper bracket to slide in place. So I've had Krista help me temporarily bolt in the rear bumper, and I wanted to do this to kind of show one of the issues that you're going to run into if you have a 2014 or newer GX. Ours is 2016, so of course we're going to run into this. And that problem is how close the swing out spindle is to the rear bumper. Now I believe the GX460s up until 2013, the profile of that bumper is a little bit different, and you may not experience this issue, but we are definitely experiencing that issue on ours. That issue is as such. So let me show you what I'm talking about here. Let's remove the supplied dust cap that you would use if you were not installing the rear swing outs. And here is the dust cap, the lower dust cap for the swing out assembly. And you'll notice we've got quite a bit of interference. And I am holding this roughly center on that spindle. So what we need to do now is actually come in and do some additional modification to this bumper profile. And the first thing that we're going to need to do is actually cut up and in, and most likely have to remove the rear, this light assembly to be able to get everything to clear. Now, some folks online have taken some plastic and cut it out in this profile and fit that back in. We will likely do that in this case. The other issue that we'll have is over on the other side. So let me reposition the camera and I'll show you that. Now, the other issue we're going to run into with the profile of this bumper corner is getting the pin that holds the swing out in place when it's fully open. So the threaded portion of this pin assembly actually keys in right here to this hole. And you'll notice we're not able to do that. In fact, we're about, probably center to center, half an inch off. So I'm thinking what we'll be able to do is when we remove this rear reflector and backup light, we'll probably end up cutting this corner of the bumper somewhere right in here, and we'll take it and we'll actually bring it up and in, and we'll put a filler piece in here when everything's said and done. And then we're going to come over here and probably, somewhere in this area right here, we will cut this up as well, and this piece in here will go away. That will allow the bearing assembly to go on, the lock assembly to go on, and the other added benefit of doing this and removing this piece is that you'll notice the profile of the factory GX bumper and the Dobinsons bumper are not aligned. In fact, you can stick your hand up through this gap. Now, my hope is that by cutting this area out and removing this temporarily, that I'll actually be able to figure out a way to suck this corner in so that profile aligns with the bumper here. Once all that stuff is done, everything is in looking pretty good, I will come back and probably make a cardboard or paperboard template for that new profile, and then get some plastic to be able to cut and put in place. Now, to do that, what I'm going to do is start making some marks on the bumper on the driver's side here, and then replicate that over on the passenger side. Both have this same issue. We'll pull the bumper back off and I'll start cutting. I'll pull the lens out and get this all set up and looking fairly good. With the corner backup light and lens assembly removed, I've gone ahead and marked out where I will be cutting for this piece to come out. So this line here is 20 inches from the front of this bumper panel to this point. And then what I did on this side is I just captured the same 10mm offset and swept it up and then back. So with all that stuff marked out, grab the Dremel tool and we will start cutting. Now we'll come in with our blade and clean up that profile. Like so. All right, so in order to get the trim piece to come up and transition nicely, I'm gonna grab that Dremel tool and just start radiusing that just ever so slightly to help facilitate that bend. That trim piece will just come up and dead end in each of these corners. Now the next step that we need to do is I need to make a cut roughly in here. And what this is for is, remember I said that the side pieces here stick out beyond the edge of that bumper. Well, I'm going to make a cut here that will allow me to suck that lower piece in. To do that, the first thing I need to do is actually take the razor and I'm going to trim this little lip right here, so that when we go to suck this piece in, it'll actually overlap a bit and I'll be able to rivet that in place. Like so. All right. Up that blade, and now we'll make this final cut. There we go. There we go. Now you'll see that I'll take this, and once the bumper is in place, I'll actually be able to pull this from the inside and be able to get this profile to line up with the angle of that bumper, and then pin that together. The final step before we actually install the steel bumper is to install our trim. Now this is fairly easy. It's got a profile on it that pushes on, and you're able to kind of force that around corners and pinch it into place. Like so. And we'll just continue this process, pushing it up on the back of this bumper and work our way around. Now we'll have to do a couple of cuts on this, but it's fairly easy. And now that we've worked our way over to the driver's side, what we're going to do is make a cut here. Now, Dobinsons gives actually quite a bit of this trim piece. So what I would suggest is maybe just trim it a little bit long, see if it fits in. If it's not, trim a little bit off until it fits in nicely. But we'll take it to about right here, pull that back off. All right, so that looks like it's a little long. So we'll come back and just trim off that much. There we go. And this can be tough getting it around those compound corners, but it should fit on just like that. We'll go ahead and move on to this side and be good. My original thought was I would just be able to notch out this area here underneath that lens assembly and everything would fit into place. Well, although that does work to be able to get the bearing portion of this in place, I'm still running into an interference with the bumper here. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut this section of the bumper out, cutting down and then wrapping around and cutting back to clear this high point. And then I'll bring the trim piece up and wrap it around up into here. That'll clear this little point that sticks out, and I'll have to do this on both sides. So with that said, let's get started. With the bumper section cut out, the next step is to start assembling the bearing. To do that, we're going to take our rear bottom seal and press that down. I filled this with grease to help with the bearing. Now we're going to take the number 7 washer, and that gets pressed down. Then we take our lower thrust block bearing, and that gets pushed down. On top of that, we will place our swing out, followed by the upper thrust block bearing, which is actually faced down. The number 10 washer goes on top of that, followed by our castle nut. With the swing out installed, we can now turn our attention to the catch where the swing out will actually be latched into. To start, we will take the supplied anchor and fasteners and install Now the key here is that when the swing out comes in, that we are centered between this 1x1 square tube and the latch mechanism itself. And actually holding right there, pull that back, and we'll tighten that. Looks good. Okay. Now for now we will just tighten this good and tight. And then we'll come back in a little bit and torque everything down. With the metal bracket in place, now it's time to install our rubber bumper. And this is actually what that 1x1 tube slides into and provides a little bit of isolation. Take our cap screw, slide it into place, reach in from behind with the washer, and then our nylock nut. And then using a Phillips and screwdriver, we'll start that and then reach in with our 10mm wrench and we'll tighten this down. Now, because the swing out metal actually needs to rest up against this, we need to cinch this screw in fairly tight. Otherwise, we're going to have that swing arm rubbing up against the screw. So just tighten it down, reach in, feel, make sure it's not protruding past the face of that rubber. There we go. Maybe just a little bit more. All right. Now before we torque everything else down, let's make sure this comes in. And we'll latch. Yep. Good over center. So open this back up. And we'll go ahead and tighten down the rest of those fasteners. So here's a close-up of that latch assembly. To use, you pull the pin, rotate it around, grab the lever, rotate it out, and there you go. Now you're able to pull that swing out of the way, then to close up, close the latch like so, and then feed your pin in. Okay, the next thing we need to do is we'll install the backup parking sensors. To do that, we will pull the factory supplied grommet out of the 4 locations in the back. And using a utility knife, we will cut the center out of those grommets. Now we want to be mindful of the inside surface here. Actually do a fairly good job of cleaning that up. You can see it is pretty clean here. The other thing that I've done is actually taken the utility knife and created a bit of a chamfer on the back. You know, one of the things that we have to do here is actually we'll push the grommet in place, and then we'll actually feed the parking sensor in from the back. Now there's that lip on that back side that makes it kind of a pain to get everything situated. So adding that chamfer just a little bit to the back of that grommet will help facilitate that parking sensor being pushed into place. The next thing we'll do is actually add a little bit of water to that grommet. This will help lubricate things and allow that parking sensor to move into place. Now reach in from under and feed that parking sensor in. Now as I push, this grommet is going to want to flex and push out. So as I'm working that parking sensor in, we'll want to hold that grommet in place. And oh, see, there we go. So we'll want to make sure that everything stays in position as we try to force this thing in. And it is a pain. So take your time. You will get frustrated doing this, but eventually this parking sensor will slide into place. And there we have it. I was able to successfully, with a little bit of work, feed that parking sensor into the grommet. All right, the next phase of the install is wiring up our lights. Now, what we wanted to start off with is understanding which of these 3 wires runs each function. So to do that, I'm going to take a 9-volt battery and I'm going to connect the black side to our negative, and then I'm going to start with our brown wire. All right, so that brown wire operates the brake light, and our white wire operates our tail lights. So we'll note that that is our brake light assembly. Come over, now let's work on our white clear lights here. So we'll do the same function. So we'll take the black and put it on our negative, and we'll start off with brown. All right, so brown is our turn signal and white is our reverse light. So now that we know what each one of those wires operates, we're going to tie in these 2 lights together so they operate at the same time. And then on our brake and running light lamp, I'm going to take the wire that illuminates the running light and I'm going to tie it to the wire that runs the light illuminating the license plate. We'll tie all that stuff together and then I'm going to run it up the back through this bumper and then up to the top, where I'll then splice into our parking light assembly. With our wires tied in below, I've run 3 wires up and we will now tie them into the turn signal wiring harness. Now, one thing you want to note is the turn signals are LED, and to avoid a hyper flash situation, what you will need to do is install one of these LED turn signal resistors. So I've got that set up here. So the white and black, or the white wire with the black stripe, is our ground, and I have it coming up and then our resistor tied in here. So now let me grab some solder and our soldering gun and we can get started. All right. Having one of these soldering third hands makes a huge difference. Now all I have to do is just unclap that one side and let's move our heat shrink in place like so. I'll grab my heat gun. And we'll heat shrink that solder. Like so. All right, our ground is now done. Now we can move on to our other wires. So you notice I said 3 wires were brought up from the bumper on this side. So that does not include the wire for ground, and it does not include the reverse light wire. And what I did is I tied in all of the ground wires down below and then connected that to the ground wire for the reverse light, and then tied in the reverse lights directly into the wire that was factory. All of that stuff's down below. So all I have to do up here is turn the brake and the running lights. So next up are our brake lights. On the passenger or on the driver's side, that is our blue wire. Now you want to always double check by tracing the wires in the back of the taillight assembly. And I did that here, and so that's what I've got. So now I've got our our brake light wire that comes up. I have it tied in with the blue wire from the original taillight assembly. Now I have the blue light on, or the blue wire on our plug, and I'm going to get those so that they're together. Grab some solder, and we will start. Okay. All right, next up is our turn signal. So on the driver's side, that is the yellow wire. And I have a red wire that was coming up from down below, and it's tied in here. And now I'm taking the other side of that turn signal resistor, and I'm bringing it in as well. And we'll go ahead and wire or solder that side up now. Now one thing you'll note with these is you really do want to have one of these soldering arms. It helps out a ton in trying to actually get everything held in place, and you can kind of fine tune things to ensure everything is properly welded or soldered together. Okay. Now after every time that I use a soldering iron, I wipe it on a damp sponge to clean off any of the excess solder before I put it away. All right, that one is done. We'll go ahead and wire in the running lamps, and we will be good to go to tie everything back together. And finally, once everything is soldered back together, the next thing you'll need to do is just reconnect and reinstall your taillight assemblies. Now you'll notice I still need to come in here and put in our filler panel. Shouldn't be that big of an issue. Once I get some free time, I'll jump on that. I'm just gonna take some plastic and mark out the shape of that opening, and then cut it, and then probably just pop rivet that to the bumper itself. There's also this little gap down below. When I fill in that panel, I'll likely try to fill in that gap down below as well. All in all, the bumper was fairly complicated to try and put together. As you notice, there's a lot of fit and finish that you have to do with the 2014 and newer GX. I don't know if anybody that has a 2013 and older will have the same interference that we have right here. But it is worth noting that if you do end up getting a Dobinsons bumper, you may have to make modifications there. All in all, it's been pretty sturdy for us. We've been able to make a couple of trips up into the mountains with it. No issues that we've noticed so far, other than a little bit of chipping of the powder coat in a few small areas. One thing that I would have liked to seen on this is these interface points where the swing out hits the latch. Having a little stainless wrap around would be nice there, just because every time you open this up and you've got that pin trying to go into the slot there, you're going to chip some of that powder coat off. Other than that, I'd recommend the bumper. It's been solid, and I think looks great on the back of our 2016 GX. Like and subscribe. Let us know if you have any comments on this bumper, if you've installed it yourself, or if there's other items that you'd like us to look at. Thanks.